Chapter 1. The Ladies' Sewing Circle. The Tuesday afternoon. Sewing Circle of St. Mary Mead was not the sort of gathering where one expected drama. A dropped stitch, perhaps, or the occasional sharp word about the vicar's latest sermon, but nothing that couldn't be patched up with a second cup of tea. The parish hall, all wooden beams and sun-warmed windows, was filled with the sound of contented murmurs, the clink of teacups, and the quiet rhythm of needles in motion. Miss Marple sat at the far end of the table, her work-basket neatly arranged, her spectacles perched low on her nose as she embroidered a rather modest lavender sachet. Her fingers moved slowly but steadily, and though she said little, she saw everything. This week the circle was short one member. Miss Cordelia Green, elderly, meticulous, and known throughout the village for her collection of antique hatpins, had not appeared at her usual time. "She's never missed a meeting," murmured Mrs. Bartlett, a plump woman with perpetually flustered curls. "Not once in 17 years. "Maybe she's taken ill," offered Miss Blount, the baker's sister, who had just stitched her thimble to her hemline for the third time that hour. "She was perfectly well at the church jumble sale yesterday," chimed in Miss Durrell, who taught piano and never trusted anyone who preferred silence over Schubert. "Gave a full lecture on Edwardian millinery, whether we wanted it or not." Miss Marple said nothing but glanced toward the empty seat at the table. Cordelia's absence would not have meant much on its own, but she had, after all, made quite a point of showing off a new addition to her prized collection just the day before, a hatpin of considerable age, gold-tipped with a cameo head. "Absolutely irreplaceable," Cordelia had said. "A family piece, quite valuable too." It wasn't like her to be late, let alone absent without sending word. As if on cue, the doors to the parish hall creaked open, and Constable Barnes stepped in, doffing his cap awkwardly. The room fell silent. It was not often the law made an appearance during tea and embroidery. "Begging your pardon, ladies," Barnes said, cheeks reddening. "I don't mean to interrupt." "But you have," said Miss Blount, her tone sharp. Barnes cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Miss Marple." Every eye turned to her. "Yes, Mr. Barnes," she said calmly, placing her needle down. "Wondered if you'd accompany me to Miss Green's cottage. She didn't answer when the delivery boy knocked this morning, and the post is still inside the letterbox." "Perhaps she's simply out," offered Mrs. Bartlett, though she didn't sound convinced. "She's not the out-and-about type," muttered Miss Durrell. Miss Marple rose, collected her basket, and gave the room a placid smile. "If you don't mind excusing me, ladies." The constable waited for her at the door, clearly grateful for the quiet authority she exuded. As they stepped outside, the early spring air was fresh and brisk, and the clouds hung like muted cotton over the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead. They walked in silence for a moment until Barnes spoke. "Sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple, but the thing is, Miss Green may have had a visitor last night. Mr. Tilling, her lodger, says she had a guest after supper, heard voices, then nothing." "And she hasn't been seen since?" Miss Marple asked. "No one's seen her since yesterday morning. Window curtains still drawn. No answer at the door." Miss Marple made no reply, but her steps quickened slightly. Cordelia Green was many things, sharp-tongued, proud, and a touch eccentric, but she was unfailingly punctual and precise. If She had said she would bring her needlework to the circle. She would have brought it, along with a rigid opinion on stitch spacing and the correct shade of mauve. They reached the cottage soon enough. A small but tidy affair, nestled between hedgerows, with white-painted shutters and an air of fastidious control. The front gate squeaked as Barnes opened it, and Miss Marple noted at once that the daffodils had not been dead-headed, and the gravel path bore no fresh footprints since the last rainfall. Inside, the curtains were indeed still drawn. A light knock received no response. Barnes gave her a hesitant look, then used the key the lodger had left. The interior was cold, the air heavy with yesterday's fire and untouched tea. The sitting-room was in its usual orderly state, except for one curious detail. The glass case where Miss Green had displayed her most precious hatpins stood open, and the newest pin, the gold cameo-topped one, was gone. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass, only an empty pincushion and a thin layer of dust disturbed in a perfect oval. Miss Marple bent closer, her expression unreadable. Then she straightened, glanced once around the silent cottage, and nodded toward the hearth. "She's not here," she said gently, "but something is very wrong." Barnes looked troubled. "Do you think she's been robbed?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wanted us to think that." She turned toward the door, "And I believe we'd better find out why, before the next hatpin goes missing, along with something far more valuable." Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the next morning, the news had travelled faster than the milk cart. Miss Cordelia Green was missing, not delayed, not taken ill, but missing, with her house locked, her supper untouched, and her newest, most prized hatpin gone. In St. Mary Mead, that was as close to catastrophe as the village had seen since the curate's bicycle was stolen in '34. At Granger's grocer's, 2 women nearly came to blows over the last tin of golden syrup, both blaming nerves caused by this horrid business. At the post office, the line moved twice as slowly as usual, while Miss Finch recounted, again, how Cordelia had once told her, "I'd rather die than let anyone touch my collection." The ladies of the sewing circle, now elevated by proximity to scandal, held court with barely concealed glee. "I always said she was secretive," declared Mrs. Bartlett, stirring her tea vigorously. "Never married, never explained where those pins came from. My cousin Sybil says that kind of woman always has something to hide. I dare say she went abroad," offered Miss Blount with a shrug. "There are plenty of tours to Venice or Tangier for ladies of a certain age. Maybe she fancied a last adventure." "Without telling anyone," sniffed Miss Durrell. "Don't be absurd. She did receive a strange letter," said Mrs. Pargeter, leaning forward like a cat scenting cream. "Day before yesterday, pale green envelope. I saw it on her table." Miss Marple, who had dropped in with a parcel for the church raffle, remained silent at the edge of the conversation. She had learned long ago that in such moments silence was the most productive form of listening. "She was being blackmailed, no doubt," said Mrs. Bartlett darkly, "or else run off with someone. Probably that lodger of hers. What was his name? Tilling?" "Tilling's half her age," said Miss Durrell, "and he's balding." "Well, perhaps she didn't mind," sniffed Mrs. Bartlett. Miss Marple's attention perked ever so slightly at the mention of Mr. Tilling. She had encountered the man only once, during a summer jumble sale, where he'd handled a tray of porcelain with what she considered suspiciously practised fingers. He had since kept to himself, lived in the back room of Miss Green's cottage, and worked, supposedly, as a freelance cataloguer of antiques. A curious arrangement for a woman as possessive of her belongings as Cordelia. After excusing herself, politely, Miss Marple took a quiet route toward the lane that led past Ormsley Hill, where the cottages curved in an arc, each one a little neater than the last. At Miss Green's garden gate, Constable Barnes stood with his notebook, chewing his lip in frustration. "No news?" Miss Marple asked gently. He sighed. "Nothing useful. No one saw her leave. Her lodger says she went to bed as usual, but no one saw her this morning. Again. Did she have many callers?" "None but the postman and that Mrs. Tuckley from the library. Dropped off a book Monday afternoon. She says Cordelia seemed anxious, whatever that means." Miss Marple nodded. "And the missing hatpin? Nowhere to be found," Barnes muttered. "Not even in her jewellery drawer. It's the only thing gone. Nothing else touched, not even her handbag. A peculiar item to steal, unless that's all they wanted." Miss Marple studied the closed curtains, the tidy garden, the undisturbed doormat. She was proud of her collection, she said softly, but she kept it very private. The new pin, though, that one she showed off, made a point of it. Barnes nodded. "Yes, everyone remembers her waving it about at the jumble sale. Gold and pearl, wasn't it?" "Gold and a small cameo," Miss Marple corrected. "An Italian piece, possibly 18th century." Barnes gave her a rueful smile. "You should have been a detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, no," she said lightly. "I leave that to cleverer men. I just have a memory for objects and people who talk about them." She turned, preparing to take her leave, when a young voice piped up behind her. "Miss Marple!" It was Lily Sedgwick, the vicar's housemaid, barely 17, red-cheeked and breathless from having run down the lane. "There's a man," she gasped. "He says he's from London. He's looking for Miss Green. Says she owed him something. He's waiting at the vicarage." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained as calm as ever. "How very odd," she said. "I do believe I'll come along." The man waiting at the vicarage was tall, thin, and dressed in an overcoat a few years out of date. His shoes were polished, but his nails were bitten. When introduced as Mr. Lionel Dagg, he smiled tightly and produced a visiting card that had clearly seen many hands. "I apologize for arriving without warning," he said in a clipped voice, "but I had business with Miss Green. She had something of mine." "May I ask what sort of business?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mr. Dagg gave her a sharp look, clearly weighing how much to share. "Family business," he said. "Let us say she came into possession of a personal item of mine some years ago. We were corresponding. She promised to return it. And this item," he hesitated, "a hatpin." Miss Marple's smile barely moved. "Well, how very curious," she said, "because I do believe that's the one item no longer in her house." Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Though Miss Marple had no official title, she was, without question, the most efficient detective in St. Mary Mead. Not by training or authority, of course, but by nature. She had spent a lifetime listening to people talk just a little too much. watching hands fidget during small lies, and observing how guilt never quite stayed hidden, even behind the tidiest of curtains. And so, while the village speculated loudly about Miss Green's possible affairs, blackmail schemes and secret hoards of foreign treasure, Miss Marple did what she did best. She listened. Her first stop that morning was the library. Mrs. Tuckley, Lavenstock's part-time librarian and full-time purveyor of information, was behind the counter, re-stamping book slips with the practiced determination of someone trying not to eavesdrop, but failing. Miss Marple waited until the last borrower had drifted away before approaching the desk. "Good morning, Mrs. Tuckley. I do hope you weren't too troubled by the visit to Miss Green." The librarian gave a start. "Oh, Miss Marple, not at all. Just a brief delivery. I was returning a book she'd asked for. Nothing strange about it." Miss Marple tilted her head with gentle curiosity. "Oh, I heard she seemed rather anxious that day." Mrs. Tuckley looked mildly flustered. "Well, she was flustered, I suppose. Kept glancing out the window and asked twice if I was sure the book had come directly from the county catalogue, which it had, of course." "What was the book?" "The Collections of Lady Whitsbury," she said. "An old memoir. Out of print, really. It details famous Victorian jewel pieces. A bit dull, if you ask me, but she was terribly insistent." Miss Marple's knitting basket bumped softly against her side as she smiled. "And did she seem pleased with it?" "Oddly not. She thumbed through it quickly, looked rather pale, then said something about needing to check the date. I asked if she'd found what she was looking for, and she said not yet, but someone else might have." Mrs. Tuckley lowered her voice. She was acting not frightened exactly, but watchful. Miss Marple murmured a thoughtful thanks, and left shortly after, her mind turning. Miss Green had been verifying something. A piece of history, perhaps. Something about the hatpin. And if she hadn't found what she was looking for, who had? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a visit to the one person who had likely seen Miss Green last, Mr. Tilling, the elusive lodger. She found him seated on the small stone bench outside the cottage, smoking a pipe and staring out toward the hedgerows with a vaguely distracted air. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word," Miss Marple said, folding her hands primly. Tilling blinked. He was a thin man, with pale eyes and the slightly vague manner of someone who never quite expected to be addressed directly. "Of course, Miss Marple. Awful business, isn't it?" "Yes, quite." She lowered herself beside him. "I imagine it's been a shock, living here." He gave a half-hearted nod. "Miss Green was very particular. We weren't close, but she wasn't the sort to wander off. Not without saying. She had visitors recently. No one I saw." He puffed once, though I did hear her talking, evening before she vanished. The sort of tone one uses on the telephone, or when one's trying not to be overheard. "Did you catch any words?" "Just the name Dag," said sharply. "Twice." He glanced sideways. "I assumed it was a solicitor or some sort of arrangement." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what of the ring of keys in her dresser? The one that's now missing?" Tilling sat up straighter. "That was always there. She used to rattle it whenever she was nervous. Said certain drawers were not to be opened under any circumstance." He hesitated. "One of them had a false bottom. She didn't know I knew." Miss Marple offered no reaction, though her mind sharpened at once. A false bottom, she repeated. How intriguing. There were papers mostly, and something wrapped in silk. I only looked once. She caught me snooping and said, "You'll be the death of yourself if you ever touch that again." I thought it was just drama. Did you see the hatpin? Tilling shook his head. Only the silk parcel. She kept the hatpins in the cabinet, never mixed them with her other things. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Mr. Tilling. That's been most helpful. As she walked away, she considered what she had learned. A locked drawer with a false bottom. A name, Dag, spoken in fear. A borrowed book detailing historic jewellery. And a woman who had begun to suspect something long, kept secret was no longer hers alone. Back at home, Miss Marple pulled her gardening gloves from the windowsill and returned to her small greenhouse. She pruned her geraniums while mulling over the timeline. Dag had come searching. But he hadn't come with threats, only insistence. And Tilling, though watchful, had not shown the faintest hint of alarm. Miss Green had been frightened of something else. Something discovered, not threatened. That hatpin, gold and cameo was not just decorative. She had thought it a family heirloom. What if it wasn't? What if it was stolen? Or worse, swapped? Miss Marple reached down to trim a dead leaf and paused. No, she thought, not swapped. Copied. Someone had planted a replica. Enough to pass brief inspection. Enough to make Cordelia Green doubt her own certainty. Enough to push her to investigate her own collection, and then disappear before she could share what she found. That was the thread. And whoever had switched the pin had hoped no one would notice. Unfortunately for them, Miss Marple always noticed. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Thursday morning, St. Mary Mead had done what it always did in times of uncertainty. Settled on a likely culprit, and spread the word with biscuit-dunking efficiency. The name on every tongue was Mr. Lionel Dag. Outsiders are always trouble, Mrs. Bartlett declared to the assembled members of the sewing circle. Mark my words, the moment someone from London turns up asking about missing heirlooms, you know they've come for no good. Like a forger to me, added Miss Blount, who had once misidentified a French coin as counterfeit and never quite forgiven herself. That moustache is too well groomed. Men like that are always hiding something. Cordelia was frightened, added Miss Durrell darkly. You heard what Doris at the post office said. Kept checking the curtains the whole week. Linden had taken their tea beneath the parish hall's old sycamore tree, having decided that the spring weather and village unrest both demanded open air. Miss Marple, as always, sat slightly apart from the noise, her embroidery untouched in her lap. She wasn't so quick to blame Mr. Dag. Certainly, he had arrived under questionable circumstances. His story, that Cordelia Green possessed a personal item which rightfully belonged to him, was vague, and his insistence that the item was of sentimental value had done little to ease suspicion. But Miss Marple had noticed something that no one else seemed to find curious. Mr. Dag had not recognized the hatpin by description. When she'd mentioned the gold and cameo details, his expression had been vague. Too vague for a man who claimed the piece had once belonged to his family, and he had looked relieved when she told him it had vanished. No, Dag was involved, but not the way the village believed. She needed more. That afternoon Miss Marple invited Mr. Dagg to tea. He arrived promptly, wearing the same slightly worn overcoat and nervous energy. Miss Marple had laid out her finest cups and a small tray of sultana buns, one of which she knew to be slightly overbaked. She served it to him deliberately. "Tell me," she said after the first polite sips of tea, "how long ago did you learn Miss Green had the hatpin?" Dagg hesitated. "Years ago? My mother had one just like it, lost during the war. I came across a photo from a museum archive last autumn, listing Miss Green's collection. Her name rang a bell. I wrote twice. She never replied. And you travelled here, on that alone? I had business in Basingstoke," he said too quickly. "It wasn't out of the way." Miss Marple nodded, as if entirely satisfied. "And did you happen to visit her the night before she vanished?" His cup paused midway to his mouth. "No." "She received a visitor, you know. Mr. Tilling says he heard voices." "I was not that visitor," Dagg said stiffly, "and I resent the suggestion." "I make no suggestion," she replied gently. "Only an observation." He left shortly afterward, declining a second bun, and thanking her without meeting her eyes. She watched him retreat down the lane, his back hunched slightly, as though weighed down by something far heavier than guilt. That evening, as the sun slid behind the rooftops and cast long golden shadows across the stone walls of the village, Miss Marple paid an unexpected visit to Constable Barnes. He greeted her with a sheepish smile, clearly used to her appearances, heralding the unraveling of yet another village mystery. "I take it you're not satisfied with the town's verdict?" he asked. "I never am when it's reached too quickly." Barnes sighed. "You think Mr. Dagg's innocent, then?" "Innocent of murder, yes," she said, emphasizing the word. "Then who?" "The lodger. He's suspicious, but in a lazy way. I believe he's hiding something, but not something deadly." Barnes leaned on his desk. "Well, there's a bit more. Quiet for now, but worth knowing." He opened a drawer and withdrew a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, faded, curled at the corners, of Cordelia Green as a young woman seated beside another woman of similar age and stature. Both wore elaborate hats, and both bore identical brooches at their collars. Barnes tapped the image. "Found this behind a dresser drawer, hidden. The other woman's name was Amelia Bracknell, from London. Died in 1929 under strange circumstances. Her collection of jewellery was never recovered." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we've been asking the wrong question." Barnes blinked. "What do you mean?" "Not who took the hatpin, but how it came to be here in the first place." She rose. "If Cordelia Green kept a stolen piece for 40 years, she wouldn't have flaunted it now, unless someone forced her hand, someone who knew its history, someone who wanted her to prove it wasn't hers." Barnes frowned. "Blackmail? Possibly, but more subtle. A push, not a threat. To make her display it, reveal it publicly, let someone else see it and react." "Who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That," she said, "is what I intend to find out." Chapter 5. A hidden clue. It was a slow, drowsy sort of morning, with soft clouds loitering above the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, and a faint scent of wood smoke in the air. The kind of day, as Miss Marple always said, when people grew careless, and secrets began to show through the cracks. She had returned to Cordelia Green's cottage, not under official business, of course, but at Constable Barnes's invitation. He had grown used to her company in recent days, as one might grow used to a perfectly behaved hound who occasionally sniffed out something buried and uncomfortable. This was tucked inside the mantel clock, Barnes said, handing her a slender strip of torn paper. Miss Marple took it carefully. It was yellowed and crinkled at the edges, as though it had been folded for years. The handwriting was faint but legible. "You know it's not yours. You were there. I won't be silenced this time." Miss Marple read it 3 times, in silence before speaking. "And where exactly did you find it?" "Fell out while I was dusting. Lodger says he's never seen it. Likely he hasn't." She folded the note. "Whoever hid it did so long ago. It's faded beyond recent ink." Barnes frowned. "Think A is Amelia Bracknell, the woman in the photo?" "It seems likely." Miss Marple slipped the paper into her reticule. "But more importantly, it suggests Cordelia Green wasn't simply in possession of the hatpin. She may have stolen it, or, at the very least, known how it was stolen." Barnes looked troubled. That would mean our missing woman had been hiding more than just a collection. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and someone wanted the truth to come out, but not by reporting it. No, they used performance. They made Cordelia show the hatpin publicly. To provoke someone, exactly." She turned toward the display cabinet where the rest of the hatpins still sat, all meticulously arranged, except for one. A silver pin with a tarnished leaf head sat at a slight angle, its base leaning. Miss Marple bent close. The velvet cushion beneath the pin was subtly indented, far deeper than for any other piece. "Curious," she murmured. Barnes stepped forward. "Something wrong?" "This pin was removed," she said. "Replaced too hastily. Look at the velvet. It's worn down from repeated handling. But this one was only added last year. I remember her showing it off at the Whitsun Flower Show." Barnes leaned in. "So, the cushion was worn before the pin was placed?" "Precisely," she said softly. "Which means something else used to sit here. Likely the cameo pin. Cordelia removed it, perhaps fearing discovery. But someone returned it and planted a copy." "A forgery? A convincing one? Enough to confuse at a glance, but not enough to pass the scrutiny of its true owner." She straightened, eyes alight. Cordelia suspected the switch. That's why she borrowed the jewellery memoir. She wanted to verify details. When she realized the truth, she knew someone had access to her home, someone close, and someone who wanted her to publicly claim a forgery as genuine. Barnes shook his head. But why? Miss Marple didn't answer. Her mind was elsewhere now, already cataloguing the chain of subtle signs. The pin had been stolen, and returned, not to conceal, but to expose. Its reappearance had been designed to force Cordelia into displaying it, to provoke a reaction from one person only. That person had likely known the original well, perhaps had even owned it. So the killer had used Miss Green, used her pride, her vanity, planted the pin, waited for the moment she flaunted it. Then something had happened. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the photograph. 2 women, long ago, seated side by side in near-identical brooches. Cordelia and Amelia, friends, rivals, sisters. No mention of family had ever been made. But Cordelia had never spoken of her early years, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, that silence was louder than most confessions. Back at home that evening, Miss Marple took down a slim box from her bookcase. Inside were letters, some yellowed, others more recent. Among them was a note from a former housekeeper in Hampstead, written years ago, when Miss Marple had inquired about a distant cousin's travel lodgings. She unfolded the note and read it again. Miss Amelia Bracknell had no children, but a younger sister visited frequently until the late 1920s. I recall her being very precise about her hats. Miss Marple tapped the page with her index finger. Cordelia hadn't stolen the hatpin. She had inherited it, or thought she had, but someone who knew the family and the truth, believed otherwise, and that someone had been close enough to plant a replica in her home. Miss Marple set the letter down, her eyes narrowing in thought. If the pin had been planted, then the killer had been invited in, which meant one thing. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was personal. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The calm in St. Mary Mead was always, as Miss Marple liked to think, a cultivated illusion, like the still surface of a garden pond, concealing darting shadows beneath. And now that illusion was beginning to ripple. The next morning she paid a polite visit to Miss Isabel Durrell. Isabel, who lived in a neat cottage beside the churchyard, was not known for kindness, but for her ear. Nothing passed through the village without some version of it trickling down her bramble-lined path. She was also one of the few remaining women of Cordelia Green's generation, though the two had rarely been seen together beyond public occasions. Jim Marple arrived bearing a jar of quince jelly and a carefully rehearsed remark. "I thought you might appreciate this. I remember you once said it paired beautifully with your camembert." Isabel, surprised but not displeased, ushered her in. The sitting room was tidy in the way of a woman who preferred objects to people, and the air smelled faintly of lavender, polish and mothballs. "I imagine this business with Miss Green has you in quite a mood," Isabel said, settling in with her customary black coffee, "though I confess I'm not as surprised as the others." "Oh?" Miss Marple unfolded her gloves neatly. "She always thought too highly of herself," Isabel said with a sniff. "All those hatpins and that dreadful air of superiority. I always said it would catch up with her." "Did she ever speak of her family?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Brothers? Sisters?" "Never, though I've always had my suspicions." "Of what sort?" "Well," Isabel leaned forward, "she wasn't born Cordelia Green, you know." Miss Marple blinked. "No? Her name was Bracknell. I remember it from the church registry. Changed it just after the war. Something about inheritance and scandal." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't suppose she ever mentioned Amelia Bracknell?" Isabel stiffened. Amelia was her elder sister. Died tragically in a fire, I think, somewhere in London. Cordelia never spoke of her. Claimed the family was too vulgar for conversation. And yet she kept the hatpin. Pride, I suppose, or guilt. Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea. "You said something about scandal?" Isabel hesitated. "There were whispers," she said finally, "that Amelia's collection vanished after her death. Some suspected Cordelia had helped herself. There was no proof, of course, but it wouldn't have surprised me. Miss Marple rose, offering a kind smile. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most enlightening." As she walked back toward the village square, the implications weighed on her mind. Cordelia had changed her name, distanced herself from her sister's legacy, and built a new persona around refinement and exclusivity. But blood will out, as the old saying went, and someone else had known the Bracknell secret. Someone who had seen the re-emergence of that hatpin, not as a cherished heirloom, but as evidence of theft or betrayal. Someone who had sent a message. You were there. You know it's not yours. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the post office. Miss Finch, the clerk, was not one to give out private information, unless one happened to have a particular interest in postcards, stationery, and discreet conversation. Miss Marple had cultivated all three. Over a discussion of envelope weights and the new royal stamps, she gently inquired, "Did Miss Green receive much mail in recent weeks?" Miss Finch lowered her voice instinctively. "A few parcels, one from Hampshire, I think, and a pale green envelope, no return address, just her name, typed." "A telegram?" "No, a letter. Looked foreign to me. The paper was thin. Air. Mail, maybe." Miss Marple nodded, already certain it was the one referenced by Mrs. Pargeter earlier that week. The letter had likely contained that threatening note, "You know it's not yours," and prompted Cordelia's sudden trip to the library, her nervous behaviour, and ultimately her disappearance. But who would know enough about Amelia Bracknell's lost jewellery collection to send such a message? And more urgently, who stood to gain from discrediting Cordelia? She found the answer, at least partially, later that day. Mr. Tilling, the quiet lodger, was packing. "I thought you might stop by," he said without looking up. Miss Marple stepped over a canvas satchel on the floor. "You've decided to leave, then?" "I've no reason to stay." He straightened, folding a shirt with military precision. "With Cordelia gone, I'm no longer welcome. Cordelia, I gather, was quite fond of your company. Despite claiming otherwise, she tolerated me. I don't believe that's true. In fact," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think she trusted you enough to speak of her past. Her sister, Amelia." He turned, visibly startled. "How do you know that name?" "I know many names. I also know you're not quite the catalogue clerk you claimed to be." Tilling's shoulders dropped. "No, I'm not." He sat on the edge of the bed. "I was researching stolen jewellery collections for a private firm. Amelia Bracknell's name came up. When I traced her sister to St. Mary Mead, I thought I might find one or two unregistered pieces. Instead, I found a woman terrified she'd been exposed. Did she confess anything to you?" "No, but the night before she vanished, she told me someone had been in the house, that a pin was out of place. She said, they want me to make a mistake, to say it's mine when it's not." He looked at Miss Marple bleakly. "I tried to tell her to go to the police, but she was too proud." Miss Marple stood. "Pride can be fatal, Mr. Tilling. So can resentment, or old wounds that never quite healed." She paused at the door. "Tell me, did she say who she suspected?" Tilling shook his head. "No, but she said something odd." "What was that?" "She said, it always comes back to the sewing circle." Miss Marple did not reply, but her mind flared with sudden certainty. there was only one person who had touched Cordelia's hatpin collection often. One person who had always admired it up close. One person who had opportunity, motive, and knowledge of the Bracknell past. Miss Marple turned toward the window, where a faint wind stirred the hedges outside. The final curtain was beginning to rise. Chapter 7. Another twist. It was shortly after 6 when Miss Marple received the telephone call. The vicar's voice, usually warm and unhurried, was clipped with quiet urgency. "I do apologize for the hour, Miss Marple, but I thought you ought to know. The gardener at Ormsley Lodge found something this morning, behind the compost bins of all places." Miss Marple, already reaching for her shawl, said simply, "Was it Miss Green?" "No, not quite, but perhaps something of hers. The constable's already there." 10 minutes later, she stood at the edge of the lodge's rear garden, the scent of compost and early magnolia mingling in the damp spring air. Constable Barnes nodded as she approached and led her silently to the scene. There, resting atop a garden trowel, half buried in rich soil, was the missing hatpin, or rather, the original. Miss Marple did not need a jeweller's loupe to recognize the difference. This was no forged replica. The detailing of the cameo was too fine, the gold settings unmistakably aged. A faint chip on the left edge, just as Cordelia had once described during a particularly long afternoon tea, confirmed it. Barnes looked puzzled. "So we were right. Someone did switch the pins." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "though not quite in the way we imagined." She examined the ground around the compost heap. No signs of a struggle, no discarded scarf or handbag, just the pin, hidden as if in a hurry, or as if it was never meant to be found at all. "What's curious," Barnes said, "is that this isn't Cordelia's garden. She had no connection to Ormsley Lodge, as far as we know." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "She didn't," she said, "but one of the sewing circle members does." Barnes blinked. "Who?" "Mrs. Bartlett. Her cousin owns the lodge. She mentioned it once, quite off-handedly, at the fete. Said she used to help with the roses when she was a girl." Joncheur frowned. "Are you saying Mrs. Bartlett planted the pin?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple said, "that someone did, recently, and whoever it was meant to send a message." She rose. "And now, the question isn't just who switched the pins. It's when, and more importantly, why now?" Later that evening, as shadows lengthened across the garden walls of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat with her notebook open, listing the events in quiet order. Cordelia Green shows off the cameo hatpin at the church jumble. Days later, she disappears. A forged pin remains in her collection. A real pin resurfaces, buried in a garden connected to a long-time villager. And throughout, subtle whispers of blackmail, inheritance, and a family legacy long thought buried. She tapped the pen thoughtfully. The timeline no longer made sense if the pin had been switched recently. It had to have been done before Cordelia vanished. But if the real pin was hidden before her disappearance, why had she displayed the forged one at all? Unless she hadn't known it was a forgery. Unless someone had switched the pins long ago, perhaps even before she inherited them, and only now brought the real one back to frame her, or destroy her credibility. And then it struck her, Cordelia. had lived her life believing that the cameo hatpin was hers by right. She had built her identity around it, her status, her pride. But it had never truly belonged to her. Someone else knew that. Someone who had waited years, decades, to exact revenge. The forgery wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. The next day, Miss Marple attended the sewing circle as usual. The chairs were arranged in the same familiar arc. Duntil was poured. Thread passed from hand to hand. But the mood had shifted. Eyes were sharper, voices tighter. The disappearance of Cordelia Green hung like a shadow stitched between every conversation. And then, quite suddenly, Miss Marple laid her embroidery down. "I've been thinking," she said in her mildest tone, "about old friendships. How strange it is, isn't it, when people know each other for years, and yet never really know each other at all." A few ladies looked up, puzzled. Take Cordelia Green and Amelia Bracknell, for instance. Sisters, yet distant for most of their lives. I do wonder what truly came between them. Mrs. Bartlett, seated nearest the window, shifted in her seat. They had different values, I should think. She offered quickly. Cordelia was always rather superior. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And Amelia had a daughter, did she not?" Silence fell. Mrs. Bartlett froze, her fingers curling tightly around her teacup. Miss Durrell frowned. "I didn't know Amelia had any children." "Oh, it wasn't common knowledge," said Miss Marple calmly. "A quiet affair, I believe. The child was raised by an aunt in Kent. Not unusual in those days." Mrs. Bartlett said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze moved gently to her. "You mentioned once," she continued, "that you worked in Kent during the war, at a small bookshop near Faversham." A long pause. "I've an excellent memory for details." Mrs. Bartlett's voice was very quiet. "I was 16. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and Amelia Bracknell died when you were 17. But not before you learned the truth, and realized that your mother's collection had vanished, along with your claim to it." Mrs. Bartlett's face had gone white. A single stitch hung forgotten in her embroidery. "You weren't trying to harm Miss Green," Miss Marple continued gently. "You wanted to expose her. The pin, the forgery, it was meant to unmask her, to show she was a fraud, but something went wrong." "I only meant to scare her," Mrs. Bartlett whispered, her voice trembling. "Make her confess. I never meant—" Miss Marple didn't move. "What happened the night she disappeared?" There was a long silence. "She came to my house," Mrs. Bartlett said finally. "I'd sent the letter, the pin. She was furious, said I was mad. I told her she'd stolen everything that should have been mine. She struck me, called me a liar, and then she left, walked back toward her cottage. I haven't seen her since." "Why not tell the truth?" Mrs. Bartlett looked up, eyes glistening. "Because I hated her, and I was afraid people would see that." Miss Marple stood. "We all feel hate at times, but secrets fester." She turned toward the door. "I believe it's time we find out where Miss Green went after that final walk home." Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test-it was a bright Saturday afternoon, when Miss Marple took her usual place at the edge of the church green, beneath the budding horse-chestnut tree. She had brought her embroidery, of course, a simple floral handkerchief she had started years ago and never quite finished, and a small silver frame that she placed deliberately at her side. Inside it was a photograph, not of herself, not of her late nephew Raymond, or even of the garden roses she so loved, but of Cordelia Green. And next to her in the photograph, smiling stiffly in a broad-brimmed hat, stood Amelia Bracknell. She did not need to wait long. The sewing circle had ended an hour earlier. Ladies were making their way home, baskets of thread and scones tucked beneath their arms. Conversation drifted like pollen, half-sentences and speculative whispers. Mrs. Bartlett, trailing slightly behind the others, paused when she saw the photo. She did not speak, but her step slowed, then stopped. "I thought it would be nice," Miss Marple said softly, "to remember them both." Mrs. Bartlett looked pale. "I didn't know such a picture existed." It was among Miss Green's private things, in a box beneath the bureau. She'd kept it all these years. Mrs. Bartlett said nothing. "You resemble her, you know," Miss Marple continued. "Amelia." The woman blinked. Her lips parted, but no words came. "I imagine that must have been difficult, watching Cordelia display those hatpins, knowing they once belonged to your mother." Still, no answer. Miss Marple looked down at her needlework. "She was proud, Cordelia. Too proud to acknowledge you. Perhaps she feared what the truth would mean, that her story, her image, would unravel." Mrs. Bartlett's voice emerged, faint and cracked. "She stole everything." "No," Miss Marple replied. "She convinced herself it was hers. People do, when it's convenient. But I don't think she understood what it had cost you." A long pause. Did she return home that night? Mrs. Bartlett lowered herself slowly to the bench, as if her legs had forgotten how to support her. "She came back," she whispered. She knocked on the door at 9:30. Her gloves were torn. She looked wild, said she was going to tell the truth, said I should be there when she did. "But she never made it," Miss Marple said gently. "No." "What happened?" Mrs. Bartlett shook her head. "I don't know. I waited, but she never came back. The next morning the pin was gone, and I thought maybe she changed her mind. Maybe she was going to run. And then I saw the paper say she was missing, and I panicked." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "You didn't harm her, did you?" "No!" The cry was sharp and sudden. "I swear I didn't." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. She had seen the tremble of real fear, but not the brittle twitch of guilt. Then there was only one possibility left. Cordelia had been intercepted on her way home, not by an enemy, but by someone she trusted. Someone who could coax her inside, offer a nightcap, perhaps, insist on a chat. A person who had watched all along, who had known about Amelia Bracknell's collection, about Cordelia's switch of name, and who had stayed close, quietly nudging things along. Miss Marple stood and carefully closed the silver frame. "Thank you, Mrs. Bartlett," she said softly. "There's nothing more I need from you." Mrs. Bartlett's head dropped into her hands. Miss Marple turned and walked slowly back toward her cottage, her mind already turning over her final visit of the day. There was still one person left who had been oddly present throughout, not loud, not suspected, but always nearby, always listening. Chapter 9. The reveal. It was rare for Miss Marple to request a formal audience, but on Sunday morning she did just that, inviting Constable Barnes, Mrs. Bartlett, Mr. Tilling, and the remaining ladies of the sewing circle to the vicarage's modest drawing-room for tea and a brief word on the subject that has so troubled us all. They gathered under a veneer of curiosity and civility, but the air was thick with tension. Miss Marple, ever the picture of calm, sat beside a tray of scones and Darjeeling, her hands resting lightly on a folded napkin. "I dare say," she began, "that many of us have had suspicions in recent days. About Miss Green, about the hatpin, about who may have wanted her frightened, or worse." A few murmurs fluttered around the room. She smiled. "You see, we began with a disappearance, and then with a theft. Or so we thought. But the truth, I believe, is far more complicated, and far more personal." She turned her gaze to Mr. Tilling. "You came here not to rent a room, but to investigate a piece of jewellery. A pin belonging to Amelia Bracknell, thought stolen decades ago. And when you found it in Miss Green's collection, you reported it to your employer." Tilling shifted uncomfortably. "I did, but she vanished before I could speak to her." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "because the pin in her case wasn't the original. It was a forgery. Someone had replaced it long ago, perhaps even before Amelia's death." Barnes raised an eyebrow. "Then the real pin was recently unearthed behind Ormsley Lodge, placed there, I believe, by someone trying to cast blame." She looked at Mrs. Bartlett. "You admitted to sending the letter, the threat, the emotional pressure. You wanted Cordelia to confess, but not to murder." Mrs. Bartlett nodded slowly. "I only wanted the truth." "And you got it," said Miss Marple. "Cordelia came to you the night she disappeared and said she would tell the village everything. She never made it home because someone else, someone watching, intervened." She turned to the far side of the room. "Didn't they, Miss Durrell?" The piano teacher froze. What are you suggesting?" "That you've been close to the Green sisters since girlhood. You were a companion to Amelia, were you not? A lady's assistant. You saw the collection up close. And when Amelia died, tragically in that fire, you knew the jewellery was gone. But it was never reported as stolen, only lost." Miss Durrell's fingers twitched at her lap. "You visited Cordelia in the months after Amelia's death. You saw the pin in her cottage. You knew." I never." "You remained silent," Miss Marple said gently, "until recently, when you saw the same pin, or what looked like it, displayed at the Fed. You knew it wasn't real. You must have checked. And so you planted the real pin to frame someone else." Barnes stepped forward. "Are you saying Miss Durrell had the original all along?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "Whether she took it after Amelia's death, or kept it for safekeeping, I cannot say. But when Cordelia appeared to possess it publicly, it threatened to expose her secret, the very secret she had pinned on Cordelia years ago." Miss Durrell stood slowly, her lips pressed into a tight, furious line. "She didn't deserve it," she said finally. "She wasn't Amelia. She wasn't anything. Just a social climbing parasite. Amelia trusted her, and she betrayed that trust. I watched her take the box before the fire. She believed she had inherited it," Miss Marple said. "She knew it was stolen," Miss Durrell snapped. "She flaunted it, every fete, every tea. I waited years for her to show it, and when she finally did, I thought, now everyone will see who she really is." "So you lured her out?" Miss Marple said softly. "Used the hatpin to bait her into the open. then intercepted her that night. "I only meant to confront her," Miss Durrell whispered, "but she laughed at me, said I was mad, said no one would believe I'd ever had the real one." "And in the struggle?" Barnes asked. "She tripped," Miss Durrell said, "fell against the fireplace. I panicked. I thought no one would believe me." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So you hid her, buried the truth again, like you had done once before." There was a long silence. Constable Barnes stepped forward and placed a hand on Miss Durrell's shoulder. She didn't resist. As she was led away, the room remained still. Miss Marple looked down at her embroidery. "Sometimes," she said, "the most delicate things are stitched together with lies." Chapter 10. Aftermath. The newspapers reported it simply, as they always did in such cases. Village woman charged in death of local antiques collector. Miss Henrietta Durrell, a piano teacher of long standing in the village of St. Mary Mead, was taken into custody following new evidence concerning the disappearance and death of Miss Cordelia Green. The matter is believed to involve a decades-old inheritance dispute regarding a collection of antique jewellery. It was, as Miss Marple remarked, rather restrained for a story that had rattled the sewing circle to its bone china. Cordelia Green's body was found the following week, buried shallowly at the edge of Miss Durrell's garden beneath an overgrown wisteria bush. A tragic fall, as the coroner concluded. No blunt trauma, no foul play beyond the concealment of the body. But concealment, Miss Marple reflected, was a kind of crime all its own. The real crime had begun not with Cordelia's death, but years earlier with the disappearance of the Bracknell jewellery and the silence that followed. Silence can weigh more than truth, she had long believed, and in this case it had pulled two women into a decades-long web of pride, bitterness, and pain. At the next meeting of the sewing circle, the chairs were arranged a little farther apart than usual. There was no talk of the Hatpin or of Miss Durrell, only the weather and the new vicar's hymn choices, and whether scones ought to have currants or raisins. Mrs. Bartlett returned, quieter than before, but calmer, too. She brought her own sewing for the first time in weeks. A simple square of linen, stitched with small, neat letters. A sampler, Miss Marple noticed. The kind little girls used to make to mark their place in the world. The hatpin case remained, in Constable Barnes's keeping, and likely would for some time. The real pin was to be catalogued and passed to a museum, though no one seemed eager to claim it. Its history had grown too sharp, too stained, and perhaps, Miss Marple thought, it was best that way. On a quiet Sunday, as the bells rang softly across the village green, Miss Marple sat in her garden among the pink geraniums, her hands resting gently in her lap. Raymond had written from London, something about a publishing party and a new young poet, with terribly large collars and terribly little to say. She smiled, folded the letter, and looked out across the garden wall. Spring had come, bringing crocuses up through the soil like promises. But the beauty of the season, she thought, never quite hid the bruises of the past. A knock at the gate drew her attention. It was Constable Barnes, cap in hand. "Just passing by," he said sheepishly. "Thought I'd returns this." He held out a small cloth-wrapped parcel. Inside was the forgery, the false cameo hatpin, the one Cordelia had unknowingly worn. They didn't need it for evidence, he explained. Figured it might be safest here. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, things with secrets often are. He hesitated. I'm still not sure how you saw it all, Miss Marple. She smiled, folding the cloth back around the pin. Because people, Mr. Barnes, rarely change their patterns. They repeat their mistakes with almost artistic precision. You see enough lives unfold quietly. You learn where the knots are likely to form. He grinned, tipping his cap. Well, you've got the eye for it. As he turned to go, Miss Marple placed the wrapped hatpin into her writing desk's lowest drawer. Alongside a pressed rose, a faded theatre ticket, and a bundle of letters from years ago. She sat back, sipped her tea, and listened to the soft rustle of wind through the lavender. Village would return to normal, as it always did, but beneath the flowers and the church bells and the respectable chatter, some truths would linger. Because evil, she knew, did not always come in grand gestures or wicked deeds. Sometimes it arrived in silence, sometimes it wore lace gloves, and sometimes it began with something as small and sharp as a hatpin.